Hey, as a heads up, I wrote this video after having dealt this whole weekend with sick kids. I hate the concept that kids can get sick, and it's something that, as a warrior, as a father, as somebody who really stresses out about sometimes these little things, that's where a lot of this video is going to be coming from, and this is just me kind of just venting a lot of that frustration and focusing it on something that I think is obviously less severe than, sick kids in that regard. Now, the great news is kids are doing real well. Like with anything, they're resilient and they're tough, but this is where this is coming from. So just note that I'm generally really happy and generally really cheerful. This is going to be just me kind of letting it all out. So I hope you enjoy the video. Sincerely, a tired Final Fantasy XIV loving dad. I hate the Final Fantasy XIV housing system, but I love Final Fantasy XIV. I hate what the housing system does to the community. I hate how it's implemented and how all these years later, it still requires so much from the developers to just support it. So many servers, so much infrastructure, so much waiting and waiting and waiting. I love how they support it with upgrades and new features, but then I hate how players are kept locked out from this system in the first place. I hate how players had to start botting in order to get a house even to begin with, and you know who you are. And I hate how in 2020, housing is still one of the most requested and one of the most cheered for announcements at any one fan fest, only to see it added and changes made years and years later, and sometimes with major issues. I hate how the situation feels unchangeable and how much time invested into housing, yet ahead of this, all of this in order for them to really fix it, I feel like it would take years and years of more work to do so. I hate how people feel that it's easy to fix, and I hate the Final Fantasy XIV housing system, but I love Final Fantasy XIV. I hate the entitled mindset that gamers take around housing, and I hate the mindset that dismisses the players who really wanted to partake in this content. I hate that they can't just delete housing and start over, and I hate that people hate that idea too. I hate that the housing system even exists at this point, and I hate how it feels that I feel that it should exist. And I hate that I've messed up that line, but I'm going with it anyway because that's how much I'm frustrated at this system. I hate that the future fan fests and live letters will devote even more time to the housing system, and I wish, among all wishes, that it would just be fixed so that anyone who wanted a house could have a house. And I hate that I know that that's not going to happen anytime soon. I hate that videos like this exist, that despite all Final Fantasy XIV does well, housing is not it. I desire for a better housing system, yet I know it's years away at best. I hate the hurt that housing actually causes players and the stress that they've experienced just trying to get a house. I hate how housing locks players into a subscription, so even if they take a break, they're still paying real money for their virtual house. I hate how hard it is to have a real critical conversation around Final Fantasy XIV online, but I hope for a brighter future for this game. I hate how housing is instanced and empty and devoid of any social activity outside of events that are then driven by players. The core aspect of them being instanced was to be able to provide these neighborhoods. But if you go into these neighborhoods, they're not neighborhoods, they're graveyards. And I hate that aspect. I would much rather these be one zone with individual instance housing so that everybody could end up taking part, maybe even competing to see what house was being displayed, where everybody could own the same plot of land, and then you could have some kind of mini game that decides who everybody sees, but you, the individual, would only see your house. I hate that it's empty, and I hate that it's instance, and I want it to change, but I love Final Fantasy XIV. I hate how none of this actually ended up rhyming, but at the same time, I'm actually glad that we were saved that cringe-worthy experience. I really, really do not like the Final Fantasy XIV housing system. I feel like a Dr. Seuss Sam I Am reference is perfect for this moment, but I can't think of it, so I'm just going to reference it by name. I hate the Final Fantasy XIV housing system, but I love Final Fantasy XIV. Sincerely, a tired Final Fantasy XIV loving dad.